The morning they came for me, I was in the tobacco fields doing what I'd done every day for the past 20 years, working the land that belonged to Master Cornelius Sterling, one of the most famous lawyers in Virginia, a man whose reputation for brilliance in the courtroom was matched only by his arrogance and his cruelty. "Tobias!" the overseer shouted, riding up on his horse, his face twisted with anger and something else, satisfaction perhaps at finally having a reason to punish me. "You're coming with me. Now." I straightened up from the tobacco plants, wiped the sweat from my face, looked at him with the careful neutrality that enslaved people learn to adopt when dealing with white authority. "What's this about, sir?" "You know damn well what it's about," the overseer spat. "Master Sterling's prize stallion, the one worth more than you and every other slave on this plantation combined, went missing last night, and you were the last person seen near the stables." My heart sank. I knew the horse he was talking about. Midnight, a magnificent black stallion that Master Sterling had purchased for an enormous sum, that he'd been planning to use for breeding, that represented a significant investment and a source of pride. And I knew that being accused of stealing such a valuable animal was essentially a death sentence, that I would be made an example of, that my punishment would be severe and public. "I didn't take that horse," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady despite the fear coursing through me. "I was near the stables last night because I was checking on the mare that's about to foal. But I didn't take Midnight. I wouldn't. I know what that horse means to Master Sterling." "Save it for the trial," the overseer said. "Master Sterling has decided to prosecute you himself, to show everyone what happens to slaves who steal from their masters. You're going to be tried in court, Tobias, and then you're going to hang." They took me to the county jail, locked me in a cell, left me to contemplate my fate. And as I sat there in the darkness, I thought about my life, about the 20 years I'd spent enslaved on the Sterling plantation, about the injustice of being accused of a crime I didn't commit, about the fact that I would probably die for something I hadn't done. But I also thought about something else, about the fact that Master Sterling, in his arrogance, had decided to prosecute the case himself, to use his legal skills to ensure my conviction, to make a public spectacle of defeating a slave in court. And I thought about the fact that this gave me an opportunity, a chance to do something that no one would expect, something that could turn this tragedy into something else entirely. My name is Tobias, and I am 42 years old. I was born into slavery in 1818, have spent my entire life working in fields and stables, have been treated as property rather than as a person, have endured beatings and humiliations and the constant degradation that comes from being enslaved. But I am not stupid, I am not ignorant, and I am not helpless. I have spent 20 years observing Master Sterling, listening to him discuss his cases, watching him prepare for trials, learning how the legal system works. I have listened to him boast about his courtroom victories, have heard him explain his strategies, have absorbed knowledge that he never intended me to have, because he assumed I was too stupid to understand or too powerless to use it. But I understood, and I was about to use that knowledge in a way that would shock everyone, that would turn Master Sterling's arrogance against him. That would prove that a slave could indeed outsmart a lawyer, if that slave was clever enough, patient enough, and willing to take an enormous risk. The trial was set for 2 weeks later, giving Master Sterling time to prepare his case, to gather evidence, to build what he was certain would be an overwhelming argument for my guilt. And during those 2 weeks, I sat in my cell and planned, thought through every detail, prepared for the most important performance of my life. Because that's what it would be, a performance. I would be playing a role, presenting myself in a way that would disarm my opponents, that would make them underestimate me, that would give me the advantage I needed to turn the tables on Master Sterling and expose the truth. They said a slave could never outsmart a lawyer. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The courtroom was packed on the day of my trial. Word had spread that Master Cornelius Sterling, one of Virginia's most famous lawyers, was personally prosecuting a slave for horse theft, and people had come from miles around to watch the spectacle. They expected to see a masterclass in legal argumentation, to watch Sterling demolish a helpless slave, to witness justice, or what passed for justice in a system where enslaved people had no rights and no voice. Master Sterling sat at the prosecutor's table, looking confident and relaxed. dressed in his finest suit, radiating the self-assurance of a man who'd never lost a case and didn't expect to start now. He'd brought a stack of documents, a list of witnesses, everything he needed to prove my guilt beyond any doubt. I sat at the defendant's table, wearing the simple clothes they'd given me, my hands shackled, looking like exactly what I was supposed to be, a powerless slave accused of a serious crime, with no hope of acquittal, facing certain conviction and probable execution. The judge, a stern man named Harrison Blackwell, called the court to order and looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Tobias," he said, "you are accused of stealing a valuable horse belonging to your master, Cornelius Sterling. This is a serious crime, punishable by death. Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice respectful and humble. "I understand the charges. But I didn't steal that horse. I'm innocent." "That will be for the jury to decide," Judge Blackwell said. "Now you have the right to legal representation. Mr. Sterling has arranged for a lawyer to defend you, a young man named—" "I don't want a lawyer, Your Honor," I interrupted, speaking clearly and firmly. The courtroom went silent. Everyone stared at me, shocked by my statement, unable to believe what they'd just heard. You don't want a lawyer," Judge Blackwell repeated, as if he couldn't quite process what I'd said. "You understand that you're facing a capital charge, that you could be sentenced to death if convicted, and you're refusing legal representation." "I'm not refusing representation, Your Honor," I said. "I'm choosing to represent myself. I want to conduct my own defense." The courtroom erupted in laughter and shocked whispers. Master Sterling smiled, clearly delighted by this development, seeing it as confirmation that I was even more foolish than he'd thought, that I was making his job easier by refusing professional help. "This is madness," Judge Blackwell said. "You have no legal training, no understanding of courtroom procedure, no experience with the law. You'll be destroyed, Tobias. You'll convict yourself through your own ignorance." "Perhaps, Your Honor," I said, "but it's my right to defend myself if I choose to do so, and I choose to do so. I want to face my accuser directly, want to question his witnesses, want to present my own case. That's my right under the law, isn't it?" Judge Blackwell looked uncomfortable, glanced at Master Sterling as if seeking guidance. Sterling just shrugged, still smiling, clearly amused by the situation. "Technically, yes," Judge Blackwell admitted. "You do have the right to represent yourself, even though it's extraordinarily foolish to do so in a case like this. But I'm going to allow it. If you want to destroy yourself, that's your choice. Just don't expect any special treatment or leniency because you don't understand legal procedure." "I understand, Your Honor," I said, "and I thank you for respecting my rights." Master Sterling stood up, still smiling, confident that he was about to win the easiest case of his career. "Your Honor, the prosecution is ready to proceed. I have witnesses who will prove beyond any doubt that the defendant stole my horse, that he was seen near the stables at the time of the theft, that he had both motive and opportunity. This will be a straightforward case, and I expect a quick conviction." "Very well," Judge Blackwell said. "Mr. Sterling, you may call your first witness." And the trial began. Master Sterling presented his case with the skill and confidence of a man who'd won hundreds of trials, who knew exactly how to manipulate juries, who understood the law better than almost anyone in Virginia. He called witnesses who testified that they'd seen me near the stables on the night the horse disappeared, that I'd been acting suspiciously, that I'd had access to the stables and knowledge of where the valuable horses were kept. He presented evidence, a piece of rope that had supposedly been used to lead the horse away, found near the slave quarters. A witness who claimed to have heard me talking about how much money could be made by selling a horse like Midnight. Circumstantial evidence that, when presented skillfully, seemed to build an overwhelming case for my guilt. And through it all I sat quietly, taking notes on a piece of paper they'd given me, studying the witnesses, listening carefully to every word, preparing for my turn to speak. The jury, 12 white men who'd been selected because they were property owners and respected members of the community, watched the proceedings with expressions that suggested they'd already made up their minds, that they saw this as a formality, that they expected to convict me quickly and move on with their day. But they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that I'd been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks, that I'd been observing Master Sterling for 20 years. that I understood more about the law and about human nature than they could possibly imagine. When Master Sterling finally finished presenting his case, when he sat down with a satisfied smile, confident that he'd proven my guilt beyond any doubt, Judge Blackwell turned to me. "Tobias," he said, "you now have the opportunity to present your defense. Do you wish to call any witnesses? Do you have any evidence to present?" "I do, Your Honor," I said, standing up, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me, feeling the fear and the excitement and the knowledge that everything depended on the next few hours. "But first, I'd like to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses. I have some questions for them." Master Sterling laughed. "This should be entertaining," he said to the jury. "Let's see what questions an illiterate field slave can come up with." "I'm not illiterate, Mr. Sterling," I said quietly. "I taught myself to read by studying the books you left lying around, by listening to your children's lessons, by spending 20 years learning everything I could. You never noticed because you assumed I was too stupid to learn. But I learned. And now, I'm going to use that knowledge to prove my innocence." The smile faded from Master Sterling's face, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before: uncertainty. The battle was about to begin, and I was ready. Judge Blackwell looked at me with new interest, his expression shifting from contempt to curiosity. "You can read?" he asked. "You taught yourself to read?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I know it's illegal for slaves to be taught to read, but the law doesn't say anything about slaves teaching themselves, and that's what I did. I observed. I listened, I learned. For 20 years I've been educating myself, preparing for a moment like this, even though I never thought I'd actually need to use that knowledge in a courtroom." "This is irrelevant," Master Sterling interjected, standing up, his confidence returning. "Whether the defendant can read or not has no bearing on whether he stole my horse. Your Honor, I move that we proceed with the trial and stop wasting time on these distractions." "I disagree, Mr. Sterling," I said, speaking directly to him for the first time, no longer using the deferential tone that slaves were expected to use with their masters. "My literacy is very relevant, because it demonstrates that I'm not the ignorant field hand you've been portraying me as. It demonstrates that I'm capable of understanding complex ideas, of thinking strategically, of planning ahead. And it demonstrates that I'm capable of presenting a coherent defense, which is exactly what I intend to do." "Your Honor," Sterling began, but Judge Blackwell held up his hand. "I'll allow it," the judge said. "The defendant has the right to present his defense in whatever manner he chooses. If he wants to cross-examine your witnesses, Mr. Sterling, then he may do so. Proceed, Tobias." I turned to face the jury, 12 white men who were looking at me with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, clearly unsettled by the revelation that I could read, that I was more educated than they'd assumed. "Gentlemen of the jury," as I said, speaking clearly and calmly, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that I'm guilty, that the evidence against me is overwhelming, that a slave accused of stealing his master's valuable horse must be guilty, because why else would he be accused? But I ask you to set aside those assumptions for a moment and listen to what I have to say, because the evidence you've heard is not as solid as Mr. Sterling has made it seem. And I'm going to prove that to you, not with fancy legal arguments, but with simple logic and common sense." I turned to Master Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, I'd like to recall your first witness, Samuel Morrison, the overseer. May I question him again?" Sterling nodded, still looking confident, but also slightly wary. "Of course, though I don't see what good it will do you." Samuel Morrison returned to the witness stand, looking annoyed at being called back, clearly expecting this to be a waste of time. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "you testified that you saw me near the stables on the night the horse disappeared, around 9 o'clock in the evening. Is that correct?" "That's right," Morrison said. "I saw you there acting suspicious, looking around like you were up to something." "And what were you doing near the stables at 9 o'clock in the evening?" I asked. Morrison looked confused by the question. "I was making my rounds, checking on things, making sure everything was secure for the night." "So you were doing your job," I said, "checking on the property, making sure the animals were safe. That's what an overseer does, correct?" "Yes," Morrison said, not seeing where I was going with this. "And I was also near the stables doing my job," I said. I was checking on the mare that's about to foal, making sure she was comfortable, watching for signs that she might be going into labor. That's part of my responsibilities, isn't it? Taking care of the horses, especially the pregnant ones. Morrison hesitated. Well, yes, but... So we were both near the stables, both doing our jobs, both having legitimate reasons to be there, I continued. The only difference is that you're white and free and I'm black and enslaved. So when you're near the stables, it's assumed you're doing your job. But when I'm near the stables, it's assumed I'm stealing. Is that a fair summary? That's not, Morrison started, but I interrupted. Let me ask you another question, Mr. Morrison. You said I was acting suspicious, looking around like I was up to something. Can you describe exactly what I was doing that seemed suspicious? Morrison frowned, trying to remember. You were looking around, checking the area. Was I carrying anything? I asked. A rope, a bridle, anything that might be used to lead a horse away? No, Morrison admitted. You weren't carrying anything. Was I trying to hide from you? Did I run away when I saw you? Did I act guilty in any way? No, Morrison said again, more reluctantly this time. So what I was actually doing, I said, was standing near the stables, not carrying any equipment, not trying to hide, not acting guilty, just checking on a pregnant mare, which is part of my job. And you interpreted that as suspicious behavior because you were looking for someone to blame when the horse went missing. Is that accurate? I thought you looked suspicious, Morrison said weakly. Thank you, Mr. Morrison, I said. No further questions. I could see the jury members shifting in their seats, looking less certain than they had before. I'd planted a seed of doubt, had shown them that the evidence against me was actually just assumption and prejudice rather than fact. I called the next witness, a stable hand named Thomas, who testified that he'd heard me talking about how much money could be made by selling a horse like Midnight. Mr. Thomas, I said, you testified that you heard me talking about selling horses. Can you tell the jury exactly what I said? Thomas looked uncomfortable. You said that a horse like Midnight could fetch a good price, that someone could make a lot of money if they sold him. And when did I say this? I asked. About a week before the horse went missing, Thomas said. And who was I talking to when I said this? You were talking to some of the other slaves. We were all discussing the horses, talking about how valuable they were. So I was having a conversation with other people about the value of the horses on the plantation, I said. Was I the only one who mentioned that Midnight was valuable? No, Thomas admitted. We all knew he was valuable. Everyone on the plantation knew that. So the fact that I knew Midnight was valuable doesn't prove anything, I said. Everyone knew he was valuable. That's not evidence of theft. That's just common knowledge. Did I say anything about actually planning to steal the horse? Did I say anything about how I would do it or where I would sell him, or anything that would suggest I was actually planning a theft? No, Thomas said. You just said he was valuable. Thank you, I said. No further questions. I continued this pattern with each of Master Sterling's witnesses, using simple logic and careful questioning to expose the weaknesses in their testimony, to show that what they'd presented as evidence was actually just assumption and prejudice. I didn't use legal jargon or complex arguments. I just asked straightforward questions that revealed the truth. And with each witness I questioned, I could see the jury becoming less certain, could see doubt creeping into their expressions, could see them beginning to wonder if maybe they'd been too quick to assume my guilt. Master Sterling was becoming increasingly agitated, standing up to object, trying to interrupt my questioning, clearly frustrated that his carefully constructed case was being dismantled by a slave using nothing but common sense and logic. Your Honor, Sterling said after I'd finished with the third witness, this is ridiculous. The defendant is wasting the court's time with these pointless questions. He's not presenting any actual defense. He's just trying to confuse the jury. I disagree, Mr. Sterling, Judge Blackwell said, and I was surprised to hear a note of interest in his voice. The defendant is conducting a perfectly legitimate cross-examination, exposing weaknesses in your witness's testimony. If you don't like having your case challenged, perhaps you should have built a stronger case. Proceed, Tobias. I continued my cross-examination, methodically taking apart each piece of evidence, each witness's testimony, showing that nothing Master Sterling had presented actually proved I'd stolen the horse. It was all circumstantial, all based on assumptions, all built on the premise that a slave accused of theft must be guilty. But I wasn't done. I had one more move to make, one final witness to call who would not just create doubt about my guilt, but would actually prove my innocence and expose the real truth about what had happened to Midnight. And that witness was someone no one expected, someone whose testimony would shock everyone in the courtroom and turn this trial into something far more significant than just a case about a stolen horse. "Your Honor," I said, after I'd finished questioning the last of Sterling's witnesses, "I'd like to call a witness for the defense." "Very well," Judge Blackwell said. "Who do you wish to call?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to do was risky, that it could backfire spectacularly, that it required perfect timing and careful handling, but it was also the only way to prove my innocence and to expose the truth. "I call Master Sterling's son," I said. "I call young William Sterling to the stand." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations. Master Sterling jumped to his feet, his face red with anger and disbelief. "Absolutely not!" he shouted. "Your Honor, I object in the strongest possible terms. My son is 10 years old. He has nothing to do with this case. This is a transparent attempt by the defendant to—" "To what, Mr. Sterling?" I interrupted, speaking calmly but firmly. "To call a witness who might have relevant information about what happened to your horse. Isn't that exactly what you did when you called your witnesses? Or are you suggesting that your son should be exempt from testifying simply because he's your son?" "He's a child," Sterling protested. "He doesn't understand the legal implications of testifying. He could be confused, could be manipulated." "Then you should have no problem with him testifying," I said. "If he has nothing relevant to say, if he doesn't know anything about what happened to Midnight, then his testimony will be brief and harmless. But if he does know something, if he has information that's relevant to this case, then the jury deserves to hear it, unless you're afraid of what he might say, Mr. Sterling." Judge Blackwell looked troubled, clearly torn between his instinct to protect a child from being involved in a trial and his obligation to allow the defendant to present his case. "Your Honor," I said, speaking directly to the judge, "I promise you that I will treat young William with respect and gentleness. I will not badger him or confuse him or try to manipulate him. I simply want to ask him some questions about what he knows regarding his father's horse. If at any point you feel that my questioning is inappropriate, you can stop me. But I believe that William has information that is crucial to establishing my innocence, and I ask that you allow me to call him as a witness." Judge Blackwell was silent for a long moment, studying me, trying to decide if I was sincere or if this was some kind of trick. Finally, he nodded. "I'll allow it," he said. "But Tobias, I'm warning you. If you do anything to upset or confuse that child, if you try to manipulate him in any way, I will hold you in contempt and end your defense immediately. Do you understand?" "I understand, Your Honor," I said. "And I give you my word that I will treat William with nothing but respect." Master Sterling looked like he wanted to continue objecting, but Judge Blackwell's decision was final. He sat down heavily, his face pale, clearly worried about what his son might say. Young William Sterling was brought into the courtroom, looking small and frightened in the formal setting, his eyes wide as he took in the crowd of people watching him. He was a slight boy with his father's features, dressed in his Sunday best, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "Hello, William," I said gently, speaking to him as I would to any child, with kindness and patience. "My name is Tobias. I work on your father's plantation, taking care of the horses. Do you remember me?" William nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes, sir, I remember you. You're the one who lets me help feed the horses sometimes." "That's right," I said, smiling to put him at ease. "You're very good with the horses, William. They like you. Now I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to tell me the truth even if you're scared or worried about what might happen. Can you do that for me?" William glanced at his father, who was staring at him with an expression that was hard to read, part warning, part fear, part something else. Then he looked back at me and nodded. "Good," I said. "Now, William, do you remember the night that your father's horse, Midnight, went missing? That was about 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday night." "Yes, sir," William said quietly. "I remember." "Can you tell me what you remember about that night? What were you doing?" William hesitated, his eyes darting to his father again. Master Sterling was leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his face tense. "It's okay, William," I said gently. "Just tell the truth. No one is going to be angry with you for telling the truth." I couldn't sleep that night," William said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was thinking about the horses, about how I wanted to ride Midnight. Father had said I was too young, that Midnight was too valuable and too spirited for a boy my age. But I thought I could do it. I thought I could prove to Father that I was old enough." The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward, listening intently to the child's testimony. "So what did you do?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle and encouraging. "I snuck out of the house," William said, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I went to the stables. I knew where Father kept the key. I took Midnight out. I thought I would just ride him around the plantation for a little while, just to prove I could do it." "And what happened?" I asked. "I got on him," William said, the tears flowing freely now. "But he was too strong. He didn't want me on his back. He started running, and I couldn't control him. He ran into the woods, and I fell off. I hit my head on a tree branch. When I woke up, Midnight was gone. I looked for him, but I couldn't find him. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. So what did you do?" I asked. "I went back to the house," William said, sobbing now. "I snuck back into my room, and the next morning, when Father discovered Midnight was missing, when everyone started looking for him, I was too scared to tell the truth. I thought Father would be so angry. I thought he would punish me. And then when they accused you, Tobias, I should have said something. I should have told the truth, but I was scared. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations and angry mutters. Master Sterling sat frozen, his face ashen, staring at his son with an expression of horror and disbelief. The jury members were looking at each other, clearly stunned by this revelation. "William," I said gently, "where is Midnight now, do you know?" "I think he's still in the woods," William said. "I heard some of the field hands saying they'd seen a black horse running wild in the forest near the creek. I think that's him. I think he's still out there." Judge Blackwell banged his gavel, trying to restore order to the courtroom. "Silence! Everyone be quiet!" When the room had settled down, the judge looked at William with a mixture of sympathy and sternness. "Young man, do you swear that what you've just told us is the truth, that you took the horse, that you lost him, and that you allowed Tobias to be accused of a crime he didn't commit?" "Yes, sir," William said, still crying. "It's the truth. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Judge Blackwell turned to Master Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, did you know about any of this? Did you know your son had taken the horse?" Sterling looked like he'd been struck. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "I had no idea. I was certain that Tobias had stolen Midnight. All the evidence pointed to him. I never imagined that, William." "You never imagined that your son might have done something foolish," I said, speaking directly to Sterling for the first time with no deference, no submission, just the voice of one man speaking to another. "You never imagined that the evidence you'd so carefully assembled might be wrong. You were so certain of my guilt, so convinced that a slave accused of theft must be guilty, that you never bothered to consider other possibilities. You never asked your son if he knew anything. You never investigated thoroughly. You just assumed." Sterling had no response. He sat there, defeated, humiliated, his carefully constructed case destroyed by the testimony of his own child. "Your Honor," I said, turning back to Judge Blackwell, "I move that the charges against me be dismissed. The real story of what happened to Midnight has been revealed. I didn't steal that horse. I never touched that horse. I was falsely accused because I was convenient, because I was a slave who'd been near the stables, because it was easier to blame me than to investigate properly." Judge Blackwell looked at the jury. "Gentlemen, you've heard the testimony. The defendant has proven his innocence. The real story of what happened to the missing horse has been revealed. What is your verdict?" The jury didn't even need to deliberate. The foreman stood up immediately. "Not guilty, Your Honor. The defendant is clearly innocent." The courtroom erupted in applause and shocked conversation. I stood there, feeling a mixture of relief and triumph and something else, a sense that I'd accomplished something far more significant than just proving my innocence. that I demonstrated something important about intelligence and justice and the assumptions that people make about enslaved people. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more thing to say, one final statement that would ensure this trial became more than just a local curiosity, that would turn it into something that would be remembered and discussed and used as evidence in the larger fight against slavery. Your Honor, I said, before I leave this courtroom, I'd like to make a statement for the record. Judge Blackwell nodded. You may speak, Tobias. I turned to face the courtroom, to address not just the judge and jury, but everyone present, everyone who would hear about this trial, everyone who would read the transcript that I knew would be published. Today I proved my innocence, I said, but I also proved something else. I proved that a slave, a man who was born into bondage, who has spent his entire life being treated as property, who has been denied education and rights and basic human dignity, can think logically, can argue effectively, can use reason and evidence to establish truth. I proved that intelligence is not determined by the color of your skin or your legal status, but by your ability to think, to learn, to understand the world around you. I paused, letting my words sink in, seeing the impact they were having on the faces around me. Master Sterling is one of the most famous lawyers in Virginia, I continued. He has won hundreds of cases. He has a reputation for brilliance and skill, and today, I, an enslaved field hand with no formal education, defeated him in court using nothing but logic and common sense. I exposed the weaknesses in his case. I revealed the truth that he had failed to discover. I proved that he was wrong. I turned to look directly at Sterling, who was still sitting at his table, looking broken and humiliated. You said a slave could never outsmart a lawyer, I said to him. You were wrong. And everyone in this courtroom, everyone who reads the transcript of this trial, everyone who hears this story, they'll know you were wrong. They'll know that enslaved people are capable of extraordinary intelligence, that they can think and reason and argue as well as any free person. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge will help change the way people think about slavery, about who deserves freedom, about who deserves to be treated as a human being rather than as property. The courtroom was silent, everyone absorbing what I'd said, understanding the significance of what had just happened. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat. Tobias, you are free to go. The charges against you have been dismissed, and I must say, what you've accomplished here today is remarkable. You've proven yourself to be a man of considerable intelligence and courage. I wish you well. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. But I'm not free. I'm still a slave. I'm still Master Sterling's property. This trial proved my innocence of a crime, but it didn't change my legal status. I'll return to the plantation, return to the fields, return to bondage. The only thing that's changed is that now everyone knows what I'm capable of. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the beginning of something larger. And with that, I walked out of the courtroom, still enslaved but having won a victory that was far more significant than just proving my innocence. I'd proven that a slave could outsmart a lawyer, and that proof would echo far beyond that courtroom, far beyond Virginia, far beyond anything I could have imagined. The days following the trial were strange and disorienting. I returned to the Sterling plantation, returned to my work in the fields, returned to the daily routine of enslaved life. But everything had changed, even though my legal status remained the same. The other enslaved people on the plantation treated me differently, with a mixture of awe and pride and hope. I'd done something they'd never seen before, had stood up in a white man's courtroom and proven my intelligence, had defeated one of Virginia's most famous lawyers using nothing but logic and common sense. You showed them, Tobias, an elderly man named Moses said to me the first day I was back in the fields. You showed them that we're not stupid, that we can think and reason just as well as they can. You made them see us differently. I just told the truth, I said. I just used the knowledge I'd accumulated over 20 years of observation and learning. Anyone could have done the same. But they didn't, Moses said. You did. And that matters. That changes things. Master Sterling, meanwhile, was a broken man. The humiliation of being defeated in court by his own slave, of having his case destroyed by the testimony of his own son, of being exposed as someone who'd been so blinded by prejudice that he'd failed to investigate properly, it was too much for his pride to bear. He stopped practicing law, stopped taking cases, withdrew from public life. His reputation was destroyed, his confidence shattered. The man who'd been one of Virginia's most celebrated lawyers became a recluse, rarely leaving his house, avoiding the social gatherings where he'd once been the center of attention. And his relationship with his son William was damaged, perhaps irreparably. William had told the truth, had done the right thing, but in doing so he'd humiliated his father and destroyed his career. The tension between them was palpable, painful to witness. But the most significant impact of the trial wasn't on the Sterling plantation or on Master Sterling himself. It was on the wider world, on the conversation about slavery and intelligence and human rights that was happening throughout the country. The transcript of the trial was obtained by abolitionist newspapers and published in full. It was reprinted in dozens of publications, was read by thousands of people, became one of the most widely circulated documents in the abolitionist movement. The trial of Tobias, a slave, defeats a lawyer, became a sensation. People read it and were amazed, were forced to confront their assumptions about enslaved people, were challenged to reconsider their beliefs about intelligence and capability, and who deserved freedom. Frederick Douglass wrote about the trial in his newspaper, The North Star. The case of Tobias demonstrates what we have been saying for years, that enslaved people are not the ignorant, childlike beings that pro-slavery advocates claim they are, but intelligent human beings capable of sophisticated reasoning and argumentation. Tobias, with no formal education, defeated one of Virginia's most famous lawyers in open court. He exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, revealed the truth through careful questioning, and proved his innocence through logic and evidence. This is not the behavior of an inferior being. This is the behavior of a man who deserves freedom, who deserves rights, who deserves to be treated as a full human being. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would later write Uncle Tom's Cabin, referenced the trial in her speeches and writings. The story of Tobias shows us that slavery is not just morally wrong, it's also based on a fundamental lie. The lie that black people are intellectually inferior, that they're incapable of complex thought, that they need to be enslaved for their own good. Tobias proved that lie false. He demonstrated that given the opportunity to learn, given access to knowledge, enslaved people can achieve extraordinary things. The question we must ask ourselves is, if Tobias could accomplish this despite being enslaved, despite being denied education, despite facing every possible obstacle, what could he accomplish if he were free? The trial became a rallying point for abolitionists, a piece of evidence they could point to when arguing that slavery was unjust, that enslaved people deserved freedom, that the assumptions underlying the institution of slavery were false. But it also created a backlash. Pro-slavery advocates were furious, saw the trial as a dangerous precedent, worried that it would inspire other enslaved people to challenge their masters, to demand education, to assert their intelligence and their humanity. Some argued that the trial proved that educating slaves was dangerous, that literacy and knowledge made them rebellious and difficult to control. Others claimed that Tobias was an exception, an anomaly, that most enslaved people were still intellectually inferior and incapable of what he'd accomplished. And some, the most extreme, argued that Tobias should be punished for his audacity, that he'd overstepped his bounds by daring to defend himself in court, by daring to challenge a white lawyer, by daring to prove that he was intelligent. There were calls for new laws restricting enslaved people's access to courts, for prohibitions against slaves representing themselves in legal proceedings, for harsher punishments for slaves who were accused of crimes. The trial had exposed something that many white Southerners found threatening, the intelligence and capability of enslaved people, and they wanted to ensure that such a thing could never happen again. Master Sterling received letters from other plantation owners, some sympathetic, others critical. Some blamed him for allowing the situation to happen, for being careless enough to let a slave acquire knowledge, for being foolish enough to prosecute the case himself, instead of hiring another lawyer. "You've embarrassed all of us," one letter said. "You've given the abolitionists ammunition, given them a story they can use to argue that slaves are as intelligent as white people. You should have been more careful. You should have prevented this." But Sterling had no response. He was too broken, too humiliated, too consumed by his own failure to engage with the criticism or the controversy. And I continued working in the fields, continued living as a slave, continued existing in bondage despite having proven my intelligence and my innocence, because the trial had changed perceptions, had challenged assumptions, had become a symbol in the fight against slavery. But it hadn't changed the law. I was still property. I was still enslaved. I was still subject to Master Sterling's authority, even though I'd defeated him in court. But I also knew that what I'd accomplished mattered, that it would have an impact far beyond my own life, that it would inspire others and contribute to the growing movement to end slavery. And I knew that someday, maybe not in my lifetime, but someday, the system that had enslaved me would fall, would be destroyed by the weight of its own contradictions, by the growing recognition that enslaved people were human beings who deserved freedom. The trial had been a small victory in a much larger war, but it was a victory nonetheless, and it would be remembered. 3 years after the trial in 1863, everything changed. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. The Civil War was raging, tearing the country apart, but it was also creating the possibility of freedom, of an end to the system that had enslaved millions. I was 45 years old when I finally became legally free, when the status that I'd been fighting against my entire life was finally abolished, and I walked away from the Sterling plantation, away from the fields I'd worked for 27 years, away from the bondage that had defined my existence. Master Sterling had died the previous year, broken and bitter, never recovering from the humiliation of the trial. His son William had inherited the plantation, but he'd sold it almost immediately, unable to bear the memories, unable to continue living in the place where his father's career had been destroyed. I never saw William again after the trial. I heard that he'd moved north, that he'd become an advocate for abolition, that he'd spent his life trying to atone for the role he'd played in my false accusation. I hoped that was true. I hoped he'd found peace, had learned from what had happened, had become a better person because of it. I settled in Philadelphia, in a community of formerly enslaved people who were building new lives in freedom. I worked various jobs, used my intelligence and my knowledge to support myself, lived modestly but contentedly, and I told my story. I spoke at abolitionist gatherings, shared the transcript of the trial, explained how I'd taught myself to read, how I'd observed Master Sterling for 20 years, how I'd used logic and common sense to defeat him in court. The trial proved something important, I would tell audiences. It proved that intelligence is not determined by race or legal status, but by opportunity and education. I was able to defeat a famous lawyer not because I was exceptional, but because I'd been given the opportunity to learn, to observe, to accumulate knowledge over many years. Imagine what enslaved people could accomplish if they were all given that opportunity. Imagine what they could achieve if they were free, if they were educated, if they were treated as full human beings. The story of the trial continued to circulate, continued to be referenced in debates about slavery and abolition. It became part of the historical record, a documented case of an enslaved person demonstrating extraordinary intelligence and defeating a white lawyer in open court, and it inspired others. I heard stories of enslaved people who'd been emboldened by what I'd done, who'd challenged their masters, who'd asserted their intelligence and their humanity. I heard about slaves who'd taught themselves to read, who'd accumulated knowledge, who'd prepared themselves for the day when they would be free. The trial had been a small moment in a much larger struggle, but it had mattered. It had changed perceptions, had challenged assumptions, had contributed to the growing recognition that slavery was not just morally wrong, but was also based on false premises about intelligence and capability. Frederick Douglass invited me to speak at several events, introduced me as the man who proved that a slave could outsmart a lawyer, who demonstrated through his own example that enslaved people are capable of extraordinary intelligence and reasoning. Tobias's trial was a turning point, Douglass said in one introduction. It was a moment when the lies that supported slavery were exposed in a public forum, when an enslaved man stood up and proved through his own actions that he was the intellectual equal of any free person. It was a moment that inspired hope, that challenged prejudice, that contributed to the growing movement to end slavery. And we owe Tobias a debt of gratitude for his courage, for his intelligence, for his willingness to risk everything to prove his innocence and to demonstrate the humanity of enslaved people. I lived until 1891, dying at the age of 73, having spent 28 years in freedom, more years than I'd spent in slavery. And in those years of freedom, I saw the end of slavery, saw the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, saw formerly enslaved people begin to build lives and communities and futures that had been denied to them for so long. But I also saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, saw the creation of new systems of oppression designed to keep black people subordinate, saw that the fight for true equality was far from over. The trial was important, I told my grandchildren near the end of my life. It proved that enslaved people were intelligent, that they could think and reason and argue as well as anyone, but intelligence alone isn't enough. Freedom isn't enough. We need justice, we need equality, we need a society that treats all people with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin. The trial was a step toward that goal, but it was only a step. The journey continues. The transcript of the trial was preserved, was included in collections of abolitionist documents, was studied by historians and legal scholars. It became a famous case, a documented example of an enslaved person demonstrating extraordinary intelligence and defeating a prominent lawyer in open court. And the story was told and retold, became part of the folklore of resistance, became an inspiration to people fighting for justice and equality. They said a slave could never outsmart a lawyer, people would say. But Tobias proved them wrong. He stood up in a courtroom, defended himself with no legal training, exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, revealed the truth through careful questioning, and won his freedom through intelligence and courage. He proved that enslaved people were capable of extraordinary things, that they deserved freedom, that the assumptions underlying slavery were false. The trial had been my moment, my opportunity to prove something important, to challenge the system that had enslaved me, to demonstrate that intelligence and humanity were not determined by legal status or skin color. And I'd succeeded. I'd proven my innocence. I'd defeated a famous lawyer. I'd created a record that would inspire others and contribute to the fight against slavery. They said a slave could never outsmart a lawyer, but I did. And in doing so, I proved that the real question wasn't whether enslaved people were intelligent enough to be free. It was whether free people were wise enough to recognize that intelligence and to grant the freedom that all human beings deserve. This was the story of Tobias, an enslaved field hand born in 1818 on the Sterling plantation in Virginia, who taught himself to read by observing his master's children's lessons and studying books left around the plantation. In 1860, at age 42, Tobias was falsely accused of stealing his master's valuable stallion, Midnight. His master, Cornelius Sterling, one of Virginia's most famous lawyers, decided to prosecute the case himself to make an example of Tobias. In a shocking move, Tobias refused legal representation and chose to defend himself in court. Using simple logic and careful questioning rather than legal jargon, Tobias systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, exposing the weaknesses in witness testimony and revealing that the evidence against him was based on assumption and prejudice rather than fact. In a dramatic climax, Tobias called Sterling's 10-year-old son William as a witness and, through gentle questioning, led the boy to confess that he had taken the horse for a nighttime ride, lost control, and then blamed Tobias out of fear of his father's anger. Tobias was acquitted, but more significantly, the trial transcript was published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, becoming one of the most widely circulated documents in the abolitionist movement. The case demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated reasoning and argumentation, challenged assumptions about intelligence and race, and contributed to the growing recognition that slavery was based on false premises. Sterling's legal career was destroyed by the humiliation, and he died a broken man in 1862. Tobias was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and spent the rest of his life in Philadelphia, speaking about his experience and advocating for justice and equality. He died in 1891, having lived to see the end of slavery, but also recognizing that the fight for true equality was far from over. The echoes of Tobias's extraordinary courtroom victory reverberate through time. A powerful reminder that intelligence transcends legal status, that courage can overcome systemic oppression, and that one person's willingness to stand up and speak truth can change the course of history. When Tobias chose to defend himself in court, when he refused legal representation and insisted on facing his accuser directly, everyone assumed he was committing legal suicide, that an enslaved field hand with no formal training could never hope to defeat one of Virginia's most celebrated lawyers. But they underestimated him, failed to recognize that 20 years of careful observation, of teaching himself to read, of studying how the legal system worked, had given him knowledge that he could wield as effectively as any formally trained attorney. His genius lay not in using complex legal arguments or technical jargon, but in employing simple logic, common sense, and careful questioning to expose the fundamental weaknesses in the prosecution's case, showing that what appeared to be overwhelming evidence was actually nothing more than assumption and prejudice. The moment when he called William Sterling to the stand, when he gently led a frightened 10-year-old boy to confess the truth, demonstrated not just legal skill, but profound understanding of human nature, of how to create a safe space for truth-telling, of how to reveal what had been hidden through compassion rather than aggression. His victory was more than just a personal acquittal. It was a public demonstration that enslaved people possessed the same intellectual capabilities as free people, that they could think critically, argue effectively, and use reason to establish truth. The publication of the trial transcript in abolitionist newspapers transformed a local court case into a national sensation, providing concrete evidence that the fundamental premises of slavery, that black people were intellectually inferior, that they needed to be enslaved for their own good, were demonstrably false. Cornelius Sterling's humiliation and the destruction of his legal career served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and assumption, about what happens when arrogance blinds you to truth, about the consequences of underestimating those you consider inferior. But perhaps most significantly, Tobias's story inspired countless other enslaved people to recognize their own intelligence, to seek knowledge despite the prohibitions against literacy, to prepare themselves for the day when they would be free. His final statement in the courtroom, his assertion that he had proven enslaved people were capable of extraordinary intelligence, but that he remained enslaved despite his victory, highlighted the fundamental injustice of a system that could recognize individual capability while denying collective humanity. If these untold stories of intellectual resistance and courtroom courage resonate with you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of slavery, stories of those who used intelligence as their weapon, who proved that knowledge is power, who demonstrated that even in the most oppressive systems, truth and logic can prevail. Your support ensures these powerful narratives continue to inspire. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What does Tobias's story teach us about the power of self-education and logical thinking? How do we honor those who fought oppression through intellectual rather than physical means? What would you have done in his position? Let us know which untold tale you'd like to hear next.